Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. What does this name evoke for you? A criminal? A terrorist? Or perhaps even a hero? The answer to these questions lies deep within the complex personality of Pablo Escobar. His life is so multifaceted, so rich in detail, that no matter where we start, there's always more to uncover. But let's begin at the beginning, in those dusty streets where his story first took root. In December of 1949, in a small town called Rio Negro in Colombia, Pablo was born into a poor family. His father was a farmer, and his mother was a schoolteacher. Poverty was their constant companion, but young Pablo's dreams were as vast as the world itself. Even as a child, he knew that he didn't want to live an ordinary life. While others might have been content with small dreams, Pablo was always scheming, always looking for ways to turn his dreams into reality, even if it meant breaking the law. The Escobar family moved to Medellin shortly after Pablo was born. Medellin was a city growing rapidly, but this growth brought with it crime and poverty. The streets were rough, and opportunities for a better life were scarce. Pablo, growing up in such an environment, quickly learned that survival required more than just hard work, it required cunning and ruthlessness. As a teenager, he started down the path that would eventually lead him to infamy. He began with small crimes, like smuggling stereo equipment, but even then, he wasn't satisfied. He started stealing tombstones, erasing the names, and selling them. Think about it, a young boy, prowling cemeteries at night, stealing gravestones to make a buck. It's shocking, but it shows Pablo's early knack for thinking outside the box, for seeing opportunities where others saw dead ends. But small-time hustles weren't enough for Pablo. He wanted more, much more. He briefly attended the Universidad Autónoma Latinoamericana in Medellin, perhaps thinking that education would offer a way out of poverty. But it didn't take him long to realize that the traditional path wasn't for him. He must have sat in those classrooms, looking around at the other students, thinking to himself, this isn't going to get me where I want to go. I need to make my own way. And so, he dropped out, deciding to focus all his energy on the one thing he knew could bring him wealth and power, crime. By the early 1970s, Pablo Escobar's name was already becoming known in the underworld of Medellin. He was still involved in relatively small-scale crimes, but he had his eyes on something much bigger, cocaine. At that time, Colombia was beginning to emerge as a major producer of cocaine, but the trade was disorganized, fragmented. Pablo saw the potential, and he saw the gap in leadership. He must have thought to himself, why shouldn't I be the one to control this? Why shouldn't I be the one to turn this into an empire? And so, he did. He brought together the small-time traffickers in Medellin, consolidating them into what would become the Medellin Cartel, a criminal organization that would soon be known and feared around the world. The rise of the Medellin Cartel was swift and brutal. Pablo quickly eliminated his rivals, either bringing them under his control or wiping them out entirely. By 1976, he was already a major player in the drug trade. That year, he and his men were caught in Ecuador with 18 kilograms of cocaine. This was his first real test. Would this be the end of his criminal career? Far from it. Pablo managed to turn the situation to his advantage. He offered bribes to the authorities, and when that didn't work, he had the two policemen who testified against him killed. The case against him collapsed. This was a defining moment for Escobar. It showed that he was not just another criminal, he was someone who played by his own rules, someone who could bend the law to his will. From that point on, nothing could stop him. By the 1980s, the Medellin cartel had grown into a full-blown empire. The cartel was smuggling an estimated 70 to 80 tons of cocaine into the United States every month. Think about that for a moment, tons of cocaine, flooding into America, month after month, all orchestrated by one man. The profits were astronomical. Forbes magazine even listed Pablo Escobar as the seventh richest man in the world at the height of his power. But with that kind of money came problems. Where do you stash billions of dollars in illegal cash? Pablo built warehouse after warehouse to store his money, but even then, rats would eat through the bills, and humidity would cause them to rot. It didn't matter, though. Pablo had more money than he knew what to do with, and he wasn't in it for the money alone. For him, money was just a tool, a means to an end. What he really wanted was power. This was the period when Pablo began to cultivate his image as a man of the people. He donated money to build schools, hospitals, and sports stadiums in Medellin's poorest neighborhoods. He handed out cash to the needy, and in return, they idolized him. They called him El Patron, or the boss, but also, somewhat paradoxically, Robin Hood. To the poor, he was a hero, a man who took from the rich, or at least, from the rich Westerners, and gave to the poor. It was a brilliant strategy. By buying the loyalty of the masses, Pablo was not just building an empire of drugs, he was also building an empire of adoration. But this adoration was a double-edged sword. It protected him, but it also emboldened him, leading him to believe he could do anything, get away with anything. In 1982, riding on his popularity among the poor, Escobar entered the political arena. He was elected to the Colombian Congress. Imagine that, a drug lord sitting in the halls of power, shaping the laws of the land. But his political career was short-lived. Within 2 years, his criminal activities had come to light, forcing him to resign. And then came one of the most shocking events in Colombia's recent history, the assassination of Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara, a man who had dared to stand up to Escobar. This murder marked a turning point. Pablo was no longer just a drug dealer, he was now a terrorist, waging war against the Colombian state. As the 1980s wore on, the Medellin cartel's power continued to grow. At its peak, the cartel controlled nearly 80% of the global cocaine market. But with power came brutality. Pablo's reign of terror was marked by an unprecedented wave of violence. Judges, politicians, journalists, and policemen were all targets. If you stood in Pablo's way, you were as good as dead. Bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, nothing was off limits. At the height of his power, Pablo's influence was so pervasive that he essentially turned Colombia into a war zone. Entire neighborhoods in Medellin were under his control, and the government seemed powerless to stop him. In one of his most infamous acts of terror, he ordered the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in 1989, killing 110 people in an attempt to assassinate a presidential candidate who opposed him. The world was horrified, but in Pablo's mind, it was just business as usual. The sheer scale of Escobar's operations was mind-boggling. He wasn't just moving cocaine, he was running an entire criminal enterprise that included money laundering, arms smuggling, and even political manipulation. He had his own private army, his own fleet of planes and boats, even his own luxury prison, the infamous La Catedral, where he continued to run his empire from behind bars, under the pretense of serving a sentence. And yet, despite all this power, despite all his wealth, Pablo remained deeply insecure, constantly paranoid that someone, somewhere, was plotting to bring him down. And they were right to plot. By the early 1990s, the tide was beginning to turn against Escobar. The Colombian government, with significant backing from the United States and its DEA, launched an all-out war against him. The campaign was relentless. Escobar's allies began to fall, one by one, either killed by the government or turning against him to save their own skins. Even his once loyal lieutenants began to desert him, seeing the writing on the wall. The man who had once seemed invincible was now on the run, hiding from the very people he had once terrorized. But even as his empire crumbled, Pablo Escobar remained defiant. On December 2, 1993, after years of evading capture, he was finally cornered by Colombian police in a middle-class neighborhood in Medellin. A firefight ensued, and Pablo was shot and killed on the roof of a house where he had been hiding. The exact circumstances of his death remain a subject of debate. Some say he was killed by the police, while others believe he took his own life rather than be captured. Perhaps he chose death over the humiliation of being imprisoned in the United States, where he had become public enemy number one. Pablo Escobar's death marked the end of an era. The Medellin cartel quickly disintegrated without its leader, and Colombia began the slow process of healing from the wounds he had inflicted on the nation. But even in death, Pablo's legacy lived on. His story became the stuff of legend, a cautionary tale about the corrupting power of money and the inevitable downfall that comes with unchecked ambition. Today, Pablo Escobar's name is still spoken in hushed tones in the streets of Medellin. He is remembered both as a monster and a folk hero, a man who brought unimaginable wealth and unprecedented violence to his country. His life is a reminder that the line between good and evil is often blurred, that power can corrupt even the most well-intentioned people, and that in the end, no matter how powerful you are, you cannot escape the consequences of your actions. Pablo Escobar's story is not just a tale of a criminal, it's a reflection of an entire era in Colombian history, a period defined by violence, corruption, and the struggle for power. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human condition, about our capacity for both good and evil. And it's a story that will continue to captivate and horrify us for generations to come.